Good morning, students. Today we will learn chapter 8, How do organisms reproduce? What is reproduction? Reproduction is defined as the process of giving birth to young ones. And reproductions are of two types, asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is biparental. That means two parents are necessary for this kind of reproduction. Fertilization takes place. Fertilization takes place only in sexual reproduction. Young ones inherit some characters of parents and some new ones. So there is a new variety of characters in the young one produced during sexual reproduction. Now, sexual reproduction leads to evolution. Examples are sexual reproduction occurs in humans. Asexual reproduction, it is uniparental. That means only one parent is involved in this kind of reproduction. So there is no fertilization taking place, and since only one parent is there, the young ones are clones of the parent or the same like the parent. There is no new characters developed as only one parent is formed, involved. So the young one is the exact copy of the parent or clones of the parent. Now, in asexual reproduction, there is no evolution in it. Example is amoeba. Now, let us see sexual reproduction in plants. In plants, the reproductive part is flower. And as you know, flower consists of pedicel, the stalk-like part on which you hold, a flower on which you hold, that is the pedicel, thalamus, the bulged part after the pedicel, sepals or the green part which is also known as calyx, petals, the colored part of the flower, gynoecium, the female reproductive part, and androecium, the male reproductive part. Now here is the picture of female reproductive part, the gynoecium, and the male reproductive part, androecium. Gynoecium or the female reproductive part consists of the ovary, style, and stigma. The ovary consists of locules, and the locules have the ovules inside it. Style is the tube-like structure, and stigma is the receptor for the male reproductive part or the pollen grains. Pollen grains are attracted to the stigma. We will see in detail. Now, male reproductive part consists of the stamen, and the stamen is divided into anther and filament. Filament is the stalk-like structure of the stamen, and anther is the globe-like structure of the stamen. Now, inside the anther remains the pollen grains. This is the picture of a pollen grain. It is present inside the anther of the stamen. The outermost portion of the pollen grain is known as exine, and the inner layer is known as intine. Now, what is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of a flower. It can be self or cross pollination depending upon the type of the plant. Self pollination means the pollen grain from the anther and the stigma of a flower both belongs to the same flower. Cross pollination, the anther and the stigma both are of different flowers. Now, through any agencies like wind, water or air, pollen is deposited on the stigma of a flower. Now, on the stigma, it absorbs some nutrients and the pollen swells up. Due to the swelling, what happens? The exine or the outer covering of the pollen grain ruptures and the intine or the internal part of the pollen grain protrudes to form a long tube. In this figure, you can see that the intine from the inside, it becomes a tube-like structure carrying nuclei. This pollen tube grows day by day and finally enters the embryo sac through the micropyle. What is micropyle? It is the lowermost area of the ovule and pour its contents. That means whatever nuclei is there on the pollen grain, this nuclei, two female gametes and tube cell are deposited inside the ovule through this elongated pollen tube. So here you can see it clearly, the pollen grain which has germinated, the entire length, that yellow color is the pollen tube. It elongates and comes down and enter into the ovary through the micropyle end of the ovule. Now, you saw that there are two nuclei in it plus a tube cell. So there are two polar nuclei and one tube cell inside the pollen tube. Now, what happens to this polar nuclei and the tube cell? Here you can see towards the right, the blue colored figure is two polar nuclei. So what happens? One among that polar nuclei or the first male gamete fuses with the egg cell and forms the zygote. Now the second male gamete that fuses with the polar nuclei and forms the endosperm. This zygote takes the nutrition from the endosperm and will develop into embryo, which will finally form seed. What is a seed? What happens to the seed? Under favorable condition, the seed develops into fully grown plant. Now we can define the two processes. First, we saw that fusion of male gamete with polar nuclei to form endosperm. So here we will call this fusion as triple fusion. Now, as two fertilization takes place, the process is called double fertilization. And that is all with sexual reproduction in plants. Please read and learn your textbook also. Thank you. Have a nice day.